Sometimes things don't always turn out the way we expect. I remember the very first sermon that I preached in a church, not this church, but the very first sermon I ever preached in a church. I was a young man still at university, and the passage that I was given was the famous story in the Gospels, not this one, but of Jesus feeding the 5,000 with, 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And I'd heard many sermons before. I knew what I liked to hear and what I didn't like to hear, and I wanted to be memorable. I wanted to be interesting and engaging and to leave an impact, and I definitely did. I went to the supermarket the day before, and I thought I'm going to use some props in this sermon, and so I purchased 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. The problem was, in my adolescence, I didn't realise that I needed to put such fish in the fridge, and I left them in my car all night and then all day Sunday before coming to church Sunday night. And I don't know whether it was the adrenaline of preaching for the first time or just the nerves, but I didn't even notice the stench as I walked up onto the stage with the shopping bag. But then I went into the sermon and I was having a great time, and I could see people smiling and engaged, and then it got to the retelling of the story. Jesus feeding the 5,000 with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. So out of the shopping bag, I took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and I said, with just these small items, Jesus managed to feed an entire crowd. And then I proceeded to throw the bread and the fish into the congregation. And at that moment, the impact was definite, as many people had to run out of the building holding back being sick. It was memorable. And so I like to tell young preachers today, if I can get through my first sermon, which literally made people almost vomit, God can do anything. Hang in there. I'm sure you can all remember a time when you were put in a position of responsibility and you initially thought, like me in the pulpit, no worries, no concerns, I know what I am doing. It might be looking after the kids for the first time as a babysitter, or cooking a meal that you've never cooked before, or you've received that promotion at work and you know from past experience, I've got this, but until you're in that moment, suddenly you feel like you are in over your head and there is still so much that you need to learn. The same can be true in following Jesus. And particularly in serving Jesus. There are moments in our Christian life and ministry where we are confident of certain outcomes because of past experience. But it doesn't always go the way we expect. So how do we respond when life is like that, when ministry is like that? Well, I think we have an answer in Mark chapter 9. And as Chris mentioned, the story follows that glorious moment in the Gospels where Jesus ascended up onto the mountain with Peter, James, and John. And there those 3 disciples got a glimpse of the divine glory of Jesus, his true divine nature as he is transformed in front of their eyes. And although Peter wanted everyone to stay there, let's put up 3 shelters so we don't have to go home. This is amazing. They had to go down the mountain. Jesus had to go back down the mountain, for there was still work to do. And the disciples needed to listen to Jesus. So down the mountain they come, and so often when you come down, as Chris said, from a physical, emotional, spiritual high, gentlemen, we're going up the mountain next week to Katoomba, it's going to be a high, but when you come back down, so often the reality of life hits like a sledgehammer, doesn't it? And that was so true for Jesus and his disciples. Have a look at the story again. The first thing, after this glorious high on the mountain, as they come down, the first thing Jesus sees and hears is his other 9 disciples having a verbal stoush with some religious leaders known as the scribes. And when he asks his disciples, what are you arguing with them about? A distressed dad pushes through the crowd and comes to Jesus to explain. He was hoping to bring his demon-possessed boy to Jesus to have Jesus heal him, but things didn't go as expected. Now, some people have noticed that the boy's symptoms, seizures and foaming at the mouth, sound very similar to, in modern days, what we call epilepsy, and a brain condition that can lead to seizures and foaming at the mouth. And so some have denied that there was any spiritual element to what was going on. There was no demon possession. But friends, just because something looks the same as something else that we can explain doesn't mean that that is the sum total of what is going on. Nor can we say in some condescending 21st century, we are more enlightened today. You know, we know that once the ancient people called demon possession, we now know is just a medical condition. The fact is that the people of Jesus' day knew the difference between epilepsy and demon possession. In fact, in Matthew chapter 4, verse 24, the two are held side by side. They knew the difference, and so did Jesus. There is something evil at work here in this boy. But when the father comes looking for Jesus and discovers that he was on a hiking trip up the mountain with three of his mates, the other disciples took it upon themselves to do what the man was hoping Jesus would do, to drive out the demon that was possessing his boy. But it didn't go as expected. It didn't work. And it was this failure of the disciples that then causes the fight that Jesus experiences when he comes down. And we don't know exactly what words were said in exchange between the disciples and the scribes, but I could easily imagine it, and I'm sure that you could as well. Scribes, see, you guys have no power at all. The Lord that you say you follow, he's not from God. Everybody else, don't listen to these guys. Come back to us. And the disciples in response saying, we do have the power. In fact, Jesus gave us the power, and we can list off people by people where we have driven out demons in his name. And in many ways, they're right. In Mark chapter 3 and Mark chapter 6, Jesus did give the disciples authority over evil spirits to drive them out. And yet here, things didn't go as they expected. And sadly, whilst the disciples and the religious leaders are having a power argument, this poor little boy is still suffering. And friends, just a little moment there. It's still so often the case, isn't it? That religious people can spend more time arguing with each other without even noticing the suffering of the world around us. But then Jesus steps in and he fixes what the others couldn't. And it's a wonderful story, again, not just of the power of Jesus, but also of his compassion and kindness in saving people who need it. And we shouldn't miss the language in verse 27 of Jesus raising the boy back to life. Because this is exactly the reason Jesus left the mountain and came into the dark valley below. To raise people back to life. To rescue people who are clouded in sin and suffering and death and evil and give them new life. And of course, this miracle points ultimately to Jesus' own resurrection. Where, like the boy, it appeared initially that he was overcome by the darkness of death, but rather he overcame it and was given new life so that he could give new life, not just to the generation there, but the generation now. Something that he reminded his disciples in verse 31, for the second time, this is why I have come, to suffer and die and rise again. But I think this story also has much to teach us as Jesus' disciples how we ought to respond when things don't go the way we expect. In life, like the dad, or in ministry, like the disciples. And so firstly, I want to talk about a defeated disciple. The miracle of the exorcism, the healing of the boy, is definitely at the centre of this story. But the miracle is bookended by a conversation that Jesus has with his disciples. At the start, what are you arguing about? And at the end, a conversation about why they couldn't help when they thought that they could. In verse 28, they asked Jesus, why couldn't we drive it out? And then Jesus' answer is fascinating. He says, this kind can come out only by prayer. This kind can come out only by prayer. Now, I don't think Jesus has in mind there that there's a certain arrangement of magical words that the disciples forgot to utter, and that's why they had no power over this evil spirit. Because Jesus himself, do you notice, he didn't pray before driving out this demon. He just said it, and it happened. And I imagine a conversation between the disciples at that point, did you hear him pray? I didn't hear him pray. What is he talking about? This kind can come only out by prayer. He didn't even pray. I think what Jesus is saying is much, much deeper. Because prayer is not just some religious activity. Prayer fundamentally, at its heart, prayer is an expression of your faith. Who you trust. Who you trust. Where your power is focused. And by saying this kind can come out only by prayer, Jesus, I think, is gently rebuking his disciples and reminding them, hey guys, in your ministry, in your discipleship, I think you have started to rely on your own gifts and your own power rather than on God. I think that's what Jesus is saying. They had started to trust in their gift more than the one who gave it to them. And I think that there's more than enough evidence in the story before us to draw that conclusion. When the disciples ask, why couldn't, the focus is, why couldn't we drive out this evil spirit? Their focus is on themselves and their power. And if you look at verse 19, there's an interesting rebuke there. Jesus says, you unbelieving generation. And many people think that Jesus is talking about the crowd at that point, and that definitely could be true. But I think he's also talking to the disciples. You unbelieving generation, where is your faith? And even the response of the disciples to their ministry failure highlights, I think, that they're only thinking about themselves. They are quick in their pride to stand up for themselves and argue with other religious leaders rather than falling on their knees in prayer to the one who is powerful. Sadly, the disciples had become just as mute as the evil spirit had made the boy, a boy that they tried to help. They were mute in their prayers, mute in their dependence on God. And so their effectiveness as Jesus' disciples and ministers was muted as a result. I was driving in a part of Sydney last weekend taking a child to soccer, as is our general practice on a Saturday every weekend in winter. And I had driven to this part of Sydney many times before, and I knew that part of Sydney well. I used to live there. And so I thought, based on my past knowledge and my past experience, I knew exactly where to go and what was the best way to get there. But over the last 12 months, the roads had changed in that area. And even though my past experience and my knowledge, I thought I knew what was best, I got lost. Not lost in the sense I didn't know exactly where I was. I knew where I was, but I couldn't find the streets that I needed to get to because of the way that things had changed. And maybe you know that experience as well. I was humbled. And what I should have done is turn the GPS on in my car, which I know updates its maps very regularly. But in my pride, I thought I knew best, rather than humbling myself and using the power that I needed to use. I think sometimes in our Christian lives, or even in our Christian service, we can all too easily start to rely on our past experience, our past knowledge, rather than falling on our knees in prayerful dependence on God. You know, when you are faced with suffering, sickness, pain, a relationship struggle, financial hardship, do you naturally turn to prayer as the first thing that you do? Or is the first thing that you do go to the doctor, go to the accountant, go to the lawyer, Try and solve the problem yourself. Now, I am not saying, friends, listen to me, I am not saying that those things are bad things to do. Go to the doctor, see a financial counsellor, see a relationship counsellor. They are good things to do. But where is prayer in your response to your situation that is difficult? If prayer is down the list, I think it might reveal to us where we think the true power lies to fix our situation. Whereas if prayer is the first thing that we do before we go to all those other good things, don't hear me incorrectly, I'm not saying don't go to those other things. I'm saying just before you go to those other things, don't forget to pray. Because prayer reveals who you truly trust can solve your problems. And that is God himself. In ministry, in our Christian service of the Lord, when we feel defeated like the disciples, when we see other ministries or churches are growing, and our temptation can first of all be to, well, what's everybody else doing? And mimic what they are doing. You know, what strategies are they using? What style of music do they have? What outreach and community techniques do we need to learn from them? Are they on TikTok? We should be on TikTok. Or whatever it might be. Now, again, I'm not saying that ministry plans and strategies or learning from others are things that we shouldn't do. We should do those things. In fact, they are often the very means by which God uses to grow ministries and his church. But where is prayer? And if prayer is down the list of the things that we give ourselves time to in ministry, what does that reveal about who we truly trust? Ourselves and our plans and our strategies, or God? So often we can fall into the trap of focusing and trusting even in our gifts rather than the giver of those gifts. So alongside our ministry plans and strategies, hang on, not even alongside it, above it needs to become prayer. Now, a question that naturally follows from that is, well, what should our prayers look like? What does a prayer of faith even look like? Well, I think we have a great example of it in our story today with this desperate dad. In verse 22, the dad says to Jesus, if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. And Jesus' initial response to the dad, you might feel is a little harsh, where he says to the dad, if you can, everything is possible for the one who believes. I don't think Jesus is being particularly harsh here. And we need to be careful with what Jesus is not saying as well. He's not saying that there is innate power in faith by itself. That's not what Jesus is saying. Otherwise, it really wouldn't matter what you believe or what your faith is in. As long as you have faith, whatever it is, that's where the power is. And it's even better if you're sincere in your faith. That's not what Jesus is saying. Not at all. Faith, in and of itself, is nothing. Faith finds its power not in the one who has it, but in the object of the faith, the one in whom you put your faith. And for the one who believes in an almighty, powerful creator of the universe, everything is possible for the one who believes, as Jesus says, not because they have it, but because their faith is oriented to one who has no limits. Everything is possible. And so here now comes the prayer of faith. I do believe. Help my unbelief. This is the prayer of faith. This, I think, is even a model prayer of faith. And why do I say that? This man clearly doesn't have his relationship with God all together. He clearly still has questions and doubts even about Jesus, maybe even questions about, why my son? Why did he get afflicted with such a condition? And he doesn't have all the answers, but he still in humility brings that to Jesus and cries out, "Help me." Help us. The prayer of faith doesn't arrogantly come to Jesus and tell him what to do as if he is a divine pinata that you just need to whack and out come the goodies. That's not the prayer of faith. Sometimes you're told that that is the prayer of faith. Just boldly claim it and you'll receive it. That is not the prayer of faith that is modeled here. The prayer of faith acknowledges your weaknesses, that you don't have it all together, and you come with empty hands, absolutely dependent on Jesus. That is the prayer of faith. I believe. Help me with my unbelief. Humble prayer like this dad, I think, needs to become to you and to me like what air is to our lungs. An absolute necessity. Not just to survive, but to thrive. Humble prayer. I believe. I haven't got it all together. I have so many doubts and questions. But Lord, help. That's the prayer of faith. Let me tell you a story about a pastor. His name was Jack Miller. And he was a pastor in a Philadelphian church in the 1970s. And just after a couple of years, Miller resigned from his church and the Bible college that he worked at part-time because neither the church members nor the Bible college students were changing in the ways that he had expected. And he didn't know what to do. He didn't know where to help them anymore, and so he quit. And he spent weeks just at home, too depressed to do anything but cry. A turning point in his ministry came when he realized that his motivation for ministry was misplaced. He realized that he had been trusting in the wrong person to see success in ministry. Do you know where he was relying? Where he looked to for the source of power and strength and success? He was looking for it in himself. And when he came to understand that, he realized that it was his self-faith, his self-reliance that was keeping him and others from experiencing the true power of God. And from that realization on, he went back into ministry. But a ministry that was going to be marked by humility, not hubris. A ministry that was going to be marked by prayer and not human power. And God did things in Jack and through Jack that he could never have imagined. Maybe, like the disciples in Mark chapter 9, maybe you and me have become mute towards God in our prayers. Because we have been relying on ourselves, our past experience, our education, our position, our gifts, rather than God. And maybe your effectiveness has started to mute. But friends, listen again to Jesus. If we remain mute towards God, we will continue to be mute towards the world. And we won't be able to help those who need us. But it's when, like the dad, we fall humbly on our knees with open, empty hands and say, I believe, but help me. Help me in my unbelief. That's when we open ourselves to experience the true power of Christ at work. And so whether you are a desperate dad or mum, whether you are an afflicted adolescent, or whether you are a dejected disciple thrown in the deep end of ministry and you initially thought, I know what to do, and then felt over your head. The prayer of faith comes to Jesus with nothing in your hands and says, I believe, Lord, I'm struggling. I don't have it all together. Help me. Help me with my unbelief. Help me to continue to trust you. That is the response that Jesus calls his disciples to make. And for all of us today, when it comes to expressing that faith in prayer, maybe there's a particular prayer that you need to pray this morning. It's a prayer that I need to pray. And it's not specifically, I do believe, help me with my unbelief. It's more even specific than that. So Lord, I know I need to pray. Help me with my prayerlessness. I need to pray that. I think we all need to pray that. Let's pray. Lord, I want to pray. Help my prayerlessness. Remind me that even with all my gifts and experience and knowledge, you are the one that gives those. And so I need to trust in you and not myself. Lord, I want to see your power at work in me and through me. So I come to you empty-handed and I say, I believe. Help my unbelief. Amen.